Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling this question. It's kind of a big one. Why do some nations really take off economically while others just seem to struggle? We're going to try to get to the bottom of it, diving into institutions, incentives, all that good stuff. And we've got some fascinating work to dig into rents and economic development by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson.
A fascinating read indeed.
So imagine this, right? You're looking at a satellite image of the Korean peninsula at night.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
On one side, South Korea is just ablaze with light, like a beacon of prosperity. But then right next door, there's North Korea, shrouded in darkness. Same peninsula, they share a history, but the outcomes are drastically different. It makes you wonder why.
It's a stark contrast, that's for sure.
And here's a fun fact that might change how you look at your microwave. In 1976, South Korea produced 0 microwaves. Fast forward to today, and Samsung, a South Korean company, is, Samsung, a global tech giant. How does such a dramatic transformation happen?
Well, it all boils down to the difference between what we call inclusive and extractive economic institutions. South Korea, they transitioned to a system that encouraged broad participation in the economy. We're talking about things like secure property rights, fair competition, and those crucial opportunities for innovation. This really set the stage for companies like Samsung to emerge and ultimately flourish. North Korea, unfortunately, went down a different path, extractive institutions. Their system was designed to funnel that wealth to a select few, and sadly, that came at the expense of widespread growth.
So it sounds like inclusive institutions are the way to go, right? So then why do some countries end up with systems that hold them back?
Right, if it seems like a no-brainer, why wouldn't everyone do it? It's a question worth exploring, and it leads us to Carlos Slim and, the fascinating, though somewhat frustrating case of telecommunications in Mexico.
Okay, I've heard the name, but bring us up to speed.
So, Carlos Slim, the telecom tycoon, he built his empire by securing a monopoly on landline phones in Mexico. And here's the catch. This wasn't just some savvy business tactic. This was made possible by extractive institutions that stifled competition and funneled that wealth into the hands of a small, privileged few.
So it's not just a lack of entrepreneurial spirit holding these countries back, it's the system itself.
Absolutely. The very structure of the system can stifle innovation and prevent a level playing field. And the cost of those extractive practices, staggering.
Staggering how? Give us some numbers.
Well, the OECD estimated that Slim's monopoly cost Mexico a shocking 1.8% of its GDP every single year.
Whoa, 1.8% of GDP, that's massive.
It is. Think of it this way. Imagine the entire annual output of the Mexican automotive industry just vanishing year after year. That's the potential loss to these extractive practices. It's a stark illustration of how these systems can hold an entire nation back.
It's a stark contrast to, say, the story of Bill Gates and Microsoft in the U.S.
Exactly. The U.S., with its history of, relatively speaking, more robust and accountable political institutions, they created an environment where someone like Bill Gates could thrive through innovation. And even as Microsoft grew, gaining that market share, antitrust laws and other mechanisms were there to prevent an unchecked monopoly, there was at least some degree of competition.
So you're saying Bill Gates isn't inherently better than someone like Carlos Slim? It's more about the playing field they're operating on.
Exactly. Their stories highlight that crucial role of institutions. They set the rules of the game. Which brings us to the heart of it all. How do some nations develop these inclusive political institutions while others stay stuck in those extractive systems? It's a real head-scratcher.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a bit like the chicken or the egg dilemma. Which comes first, the inclusive politics or the inclusive economy?
It's a real tangled web, for sure. But let's dive into the U.S. patent system for a second. What made it so successful, in fostering innovation?
Yeah, good point. The U.S. patent system is often cited as a key factor in their economic rise.
Exactly. And I think it boils down to the fact that the U.S. back then, they had this foundation, relatively speaking, of course, of inclusive political institutions. They had a strong central government capable of enforcing those patents, so inventors knew they could reap the rewards of their creativity, right? But here's the crucial thing. Power wasn't all concentrated in one place. There was a degree of, diffusion. It meant that no single entity could just hijack the system for their own gain.
So it wasn't just about having a bright idea. It was about having a system where anyone, regardless of their background, could potentially succeed if they had a breakthrough.
Absolutely. Level playing field, or at least a closer approximation of one. And here's a fun fact that might surprise you. The U.S. Postal Service actually played a significant role in fostering this environment of innovation.
Wait, hold on. The post office? I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Think about it. Back in the 19th century, for a lot of Americans, the post office was the government, in a sense. It was the institution that connected this vast, expanding nation, enabling the flow of information, goods, even patent applications.
You kidding? People could mail in their patent application.
You bet. And get this, it was free. That seemingly small detail. It was a deliberate policy choice that lowered those barriers to entry, letting anyone, anywhere, get in on the action, participate in this whole burgeoning innovation economy.
Wow. Talk about unsung heroes of innovation, right? The post office. That's a history lesson I missed. But it makes you wonder, can a country have a booming economy with inclusive economic institutions, even if their politics are still extractive? And that brings us to China.
Ah, yes, China. A fascinating paradox, wouldn't you say? Since 1978, they've seen this incredible economic boom. And part of that, no doubt, comes from embracing those market-oriented reforms, incentivizing individual initiative, all that. But here's the thing. This economic surge happened under the watchful eye of, well, the Chinese Communist Party. And they aren't exactly known for their inclusive political practices.
Right, exactly. It's like they're defying the rule book. So is China the exception that proves the rule, or are they playing with fire?
Well, if history has taught us anything, it's that this extractive growth model, as it's often called, it's not stable in the long run. Take Argentina, for example. Before 1920, or even the Soviet Union, both had these periods of impressive economic growth driven by, you guessed it, extractive political systems. But those systems, they ended up being their downfall. Yeah. Why? Because that concentration of power, that lack of accountability creates distortions, imbalances, and eventually undermines long-term prosperity.
Sobering thought. But hold on a second. Didn't South Korea manage to shift from extractive politics to a more inclusive system? Could China pull off a similar move?
It's possible, sure, but there are crucial differences. South Korea's transition, it was driven in part by those external pressures, like the threat of communism, pushed them to solidify their system. China's situation, well, it's different. They've been incredibly good at maintaining stability while growing the economy, and frankly, that lessens that internal pressure for change. Plus, let's be real, the Chinese Communist Party hasn't shown any signs of giving up its grip on power. If anything, they seem to be moving towards even greater control.
So are we saying that instead of seeing China follow South Korea's path toward inclusivity, they might be headed down a Zimbabwe route? That's a bit unnerving, to say the least.
Yeah, Zimbabwe's experience after independence, it really highlights the risks when you have inclusive economic institutions, but without those corresponding political reforms. You get this concentration of wealth, often in the hands of a select few, and then a newly empowered political elite eager to, well, seize those assets for themselves.
It creates this vicious cycle of corruption, instability, and ultimately everyone's living standards suffer except for those at the very top. So we've got these two forces at play, these economic institutions that decide who benefits from growth, and then the political institutions that determine who gets to shape those economic institutions. But it's not a set it and forget it situation, is it? These institutions can change, evolve, even be completely overturned.
Exactly. Societies, they're dynamic, always in flux. And these moments of potential change, these turning points, we call them critical junctures, specific moments in history where a big shock, an upheaval, it creates an opening, a chance for dramatic shifts in a nation's institutional landscape.
Okay, I like where this is going. Give me an example. What kind of critical juncture are we talking about? I'm imagining like a historical fork in the road.
Think about the discovery of the Americas. It wasn't just finding some new land and resources, right? It was seismic. It reverberated through the institutions of Europe, and it played out in some fascinating and often very different ways.
They color me intrigued. How did discovering the Americas reshape things for the European powers?
Let's take Spain. Back then, they were in the midst of consolidating power under the monarchy. And when all that wealth started pouring in from the New World, the crown used it strategically. They further centralized their control, actually undermining the existing representative institutions. It was a recipe for extraction on a massive scale.
So hold on, the discovery of the Americas, which you think would be this huge opportunity for everyone, it actually ended up strengthening a system that was already extractive. That's kind of a plot twist.
It is. But now let's compare that to England. They were heavily involved in colonizing the Americas too, but their political setup was different. The English monarchy, compared to Spain, was weaker, less able to monopolize all those colonial riches. And importantly, you had this rising merchant class. They had the means and the motive to challenge the crown.
Because they saw that even with all the wealth coming from the New World, an extractive system would ultimately hold them back.
Exactly. They saw the writing on the wall. And that tension, that struggle for power, it led to the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And that wasn't just a swap of one king for another. This was a restructuring, a fundamental shift in English institutions toward greater inclusivity, setting the stage for, well, the Industrial Revolution.
So a critical juncture like discovering the Americas, it doesn't dictate the outcome. It's how societies, with their existing institutions, with their power dynamics, it's how they respond to that upheaval that determines if they go the route of inclusivity or if they fall deeper into extraction. That's fascinating.
It is. And here's a key insight. It's not just about the elites calling the shots. The Glorious Revolution worked because you had this broad coalition, different groups, all united against a common enemy, that extractive monarchy.
Strength in numbers. But even when a revolution succeeds, when those old extractive institutions get torn down, there's no guarantee things will stay that way, is there? Look at Zimbabwe. They overthrew one oppressive regime only to have it replaced by another. What happened there?
Zimbabwe's story is heartbreaking. They had this golden opportunity to create a truly inclusive society, but they fell victim to, well, it's sometimes called the iron law of oligarchy. The old guard was gone, but then a new elite, often driven by those same self-serving impulses, they just took their place.
It's like that saying, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Depressing, but often true.
Exactly. And with Zimbabwe, that new boss, Robert Mugabe, he was even more ruthless, more effective at consolidating power. He dismantled any semblance of inclusive institutions, enriching himself, his cronies, at the expense of the very people he was supposed to be liberating.
It goes to show that winning a revolution is just the first step, the real challenge, winning the peace, building institutions that can resist those forces, that want to slide back into those old extractive ways of doing things.
And that's where those broad coalitions we talked about, they're crucial. If you want lasting change, meaningful change, the kind that benefits everyone, not just a select few, you need buy-in. You need active participation from a broad cross-section of society. It's about building a system where power is more distributed, where no one person, no one group can hijack the system.
So it's about building those safeguards right into the system, those checks and balances.
Exactly. And remember, it's not a one-and-done deal. It's an ongoing process. Even in a place like the U.S., with its long history of, again, relatively inclusive institutions, there's always this need for vigilance, for people to stay engaged, to make sure those institutions are serving the people they're meant to serve.
It's a constant balancing act, this push and pull between those who want to hoard power and those fighting for a more equitable system. Makes you wonder, where do we go from here? Are we making any progress towards a more inclusive world, or are we doomed to repeat those same old mistakes?
That's the question, isn't it? The one that keeps historians, economists, all of us up at night. But here's the thing about those critical junctures we've been discussing. They're not just things of the past. They're happening right now, all around us.
You're right. So what are the defining critical junctures of our time? The events that could reshape everything, for better or worse. What are we facing today?
Oh, there's a lot to unpack. We've got this unprecedented technological change happening. We're dealing with climate change, a world that seems more and more fractured by political divides. Each one of these, each challenge, each turning point, it's a chance for us to move toward more inclusive institutions or slide back into those extractive patterns.
So the future is unwritten. It all depends on the choices we make, individually and together, as we face these challenges.
Exactly. Take something like artificial intelligence, AI. Huge potential to benefit humanity, better productivity, better healthcare, even tackling big global problems. But there's also risk. If AI isn't developed and used with inclusivity in mind, it could actually make inequality worse, concentrating even more wealth and power in the hands of a few.
It's like we're standing at a crossroads. One path leads to technology empowering everyone, and the other, well, it leads to the already privileged becoming even more powerful.
And that's just one example. Climate change is another critical juncture. Can we come together as a global community, cooperate and create policies for a just and equitable transition to a sustainable future? Or will we retreat into nationalism, scramble for resources, and see existing power structures become even more entrenched?
Okay, I'm officially feeling the weight of all this, but you're also highlighting something crucial. We're not helpless bystanders. We have a voice. We can make choices that shape these outcomes.
Exactly. And that's why these conversations are so important. By understanding the forces that have driven prosperity for some and kept others trapped in poverty, by understanding those patterns of extraction and inclusion, we can make more informed decisions in our lives, with our votes, and how we engage with the world around us.
So to sum it up, you're asking our listeners to stay informed, stay engaged, and dare I say, stay hopeful.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And that brings us back to where we started. Why do some nations fail while others thrive? It's complex. Economics, politics, history, culture, it all factors in. But at the heart of it, often it's about the institutions a society builds. Do those institutions create opportunity for everyone, or do they concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a select few? We just scratched the surface today, but I hope this deep dive gave you something to think about, maybe even a few aha moments.
We covered a lot, but if you take away just one thing, let it be this. The future isn't set in stone. We have the power, together, to shape the direction of our societies, to write a different story, a story of inclusivity, shared prosperity, real progress for everyone.
Beautifully said. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.